needing to heal properly. So we certainly need to continue praying for Sandra. And like I say, when everybody is together, I'll give a little more detailed information on that. We're certainly glad that Sister Sue is able to be out this morning. She's still dealing with her back, not being able to get help. Billy, of course, has been down with her back for weeks, praying that this Wednesday she'll be able to get the epidural that will help her. And there are others, but we just mentioned those. All right, here in 1 Timothy chapter 5, what we have are different relationships that are pointed out. And this particular lesson is divided into, or it has 2 chapters, and I'm going to divide it, and the book kind of divides it. We're going to look at chapter 5 this morning and try to get possibly through that, and then we'll look at chapter 6 Wednesday night. But chapter 5, and Bobby, his is similar to what I have here on the board, can be broken down really into 5 different categories, and we're going to look at them that way. The first thing we're going to look at in the first 2 verses talks about reprimanding and how that is to be done. Verses 3 through 16 talks about the care of widows and also those who are family. Verses 17 through 20 talks about the treatment of elders, and we'll talk about that word there as well. Elder or elders is used 2 different ways in this particular chapter. And then there's some personal instruction, verses 21 through 23, and then the ultimate judgment of God, verses 24 and 25. So let's begin, and we'll just read the first 2 verses of 1 Timothy chapter 5. Do not rebuke an older man, but exhort him as a father, the younger men as brothers, the older women as mothers, the younger as sisters, with all purity. What is, and this will answer some of our questions, but what is the negative beginning of this verse? He says not. Do not rebuke. Okay, what does that word rebuke mean?
Blame, reprimand.
Okay, reprimand, blame. He says, do not rebuke an older man, but, and this older man, do you have a translation, what do you have a translation that uses a different word? Elder. The New King James uses the word older, which is the idea here. It's not talking about a man who meets the qualifications given in 1 Timothy chapter 3 or Titus chapter 1. Here's an older man. And so what we're seeing is the treatment toward older men, toward older women, toward younger men, toward younger women. And we're to be careful how we treat each other. He says, instead, do not rebuke an older man, but rather exhort him. Exhort him how? Now, you know, that just, and I was thinking as I was reading through this and studying this, you know, you ever seen a child be disrespectful to their father, or a son be disrespectful to his father, or a daughter be disrespectful to her father? I have too. And what I would say here, what Paul is saying, is based on a lot of other things, and that is the very fact that it's understood that as a son we ought to show respect to our fathers, to our mothers. As a daughter we ought to show respect to our fathers and our mothers. And he says, do not rebuke them, but entreat them as a father, exhort them as a father. And so however we would treat our father, I would say this, in the most respectful way that we know how. That's how we're to treat other older people, older men.
With honor.
With honor. I'll get bogged down if I don't go on. Okay, the younger men as brothers. You know, and I have that same thing. If you have a brother, I'm sure you always treated your brother with love and concern and care. Probably not. I have 2 brothers. They mistreated me my whole life. That's part of my problem right now. I'm trying to overcome that. No, but you know what? You might act that way toward one another. If somebody else got in the mix, guess what you'd do? Man, you'd take up for each other. You'd show concern for each other. And that's what the Lord wants us to do. The older women, as mothers, again, honor your father and your mother. The younger as sisters. And then he says at the end, with all purity. Again, Paul is writing to Timothy. He's stressing to him the need for sound doctrine. And he's saying to Timothy, this probably 35 to 38-year-old man, here's the way older men, younger men, older women, younger women are to be treated. And it's to be done with all purity. Why would he give that instruction?
Purity denotes unblemished or clean, and we're to keep the gospel pure, or the doctrine pure.
All right.
So, by keeping the doctrine pure, the only way we can do that is root out all sin and all evil. So that doesn't mean that we just avoid, making a correction if it needs to be made, but we need to do it in the right way. And I think that's what the
All right.
He leaves nothing open, all purity.
With all purity, that's right. So as we treat one another, here is, as a young man, he may entreat a younger woman. He needs to do that with all purity. A young man and an older woman. An older man, all of that is to be done with all purity. And I would just, I would add this. I just think about just above board. You want to be sure your actions, your behavior is unquestionable. It cannot be questioned as far as any ulterior motive. And so here are instructions given. Would anyone else like to make a comment on these first two verses?
Just quickly to answer your question, why would he do that? He's passing the torch.
He is. You're right. That's right. He's passing the torch. When you get to 2 Timothy chapter 2, one of the things he says to Timothy is flee youthful lust. And so there are all kinds of things, but that's right, man. He's passing the torch to Timothy. All right, verse 3. Let me get back to 1 Timothy. We'll read down through verse 16 and then come back and discuss that. Honor widows who are really widows. You may have a translation that says, we're widows indeed. Verse 4. But if any widow has children or grandchildren, let them first learn to show piety at home and to repay their parents, for this is good and acceptable before God. Now she who is really a widow and left alone trusts in God and continues in supplications and prayers night and day. Excuse me, I didn't read that very well. Let me go back to verse 5. Now she who is really a widow and left alone trusts in God and continues in supplications and prayers night and day. But she who lives in pleasure is dead while she lives. And these things command that they may be blameless. But if anyone does not provide for his own, and especially for those of his household, he has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. But do not let a widow under 60 years old be taken into the number, and not unless she has been the wife of one man, well reported for good works, if she has brought up children, if she has lodged strangers, if she has washed the saints' feet, if she has relieved the afflicted, if she has diligently followed every good work. But refuse the younger widows, for when they have begun to grow wanton against Christ, they desire to marry, having condemnation because they have cast off their first faith. And besides, they learn to be idle, wandering about from house to house, and not only idle, but also gossips and busybodies, saying things which they ought not. Therefore I desire that the younger widows marry, bear children, manage the home, give no opportunity to the adversary to speak reproachfully. For some have already turned aside after Satan. If any believing man or woman has widows, let them relieve them, and do not let the church be burdened, that it may relieve those who are really widows. Two different groups of widows under discussion here. One, Paul refers to as widows, really widows or widows indeed. And there is a certain way that they are dealt with, or they are helped, let me put it that way. And then there are widows who do not meet this, and this widow indeed criteria. And there are ways that their needs are to be handled as well. And so when we begin there in verse 3, again, honor. Now we have quite a few widows in our congregation. And so this ought to really, not that it should and other passages shouldn't, but here's something that's applicable. So very applicable. Widows, honor widows who are really widows. That is, widows who are indeed. Let's talk about that group first. Widows who are widows indeed. What would need to be true of a widow for her to meet this criteria of being called a widow indeed according to this passage here?
Age.
Okay, age. She would have to be at least 60. She would have to be at least 60. What besides age?
Without children.
All right. Verse 5 says, now she who is a widow indeed, or really a widow, and left alone, I take that she's alone. She doesn't have family that can care for her. And so whose responsibility does that fall upon? The church. The church. And let me back up, and that's the right answer. Let me back up again. The church is the right answer. But let me ask it again, whose responsibility is that? And let's answer a little different. That answer's right. It's everyone's responsibility who is a Christian. Because we are a part of a family. And family is to take care of family. But here is a special circumstance. Here is a woman, a widow, who is 60 years old or older. She does not have children. She's alone. She trusts in God. She prays night and day, verse 4 says. And then I want to drop down to verse 9, because that's where it picks back up with this widow. Tim mentioned the fact that she's to be 60. What else does it say? The wife of one man. There's that same discussion that we could have over the husband of one wife, the wife of one man. Well, what else? Verse 10. Okay, she's been well reported for good works. It's known. People have seen and they realize here is someone who has been involved in good works. What else does it say about her? Okay, so that means she has children. She's brought up children. It gets into the, probably years ago when I was young, I said, well, you should have children. Well, that's not what it says. It doesn't say she has to physically have the children. We have adoption today, and those children are brought up by those parents. So here, she has brought up children. What else has she done? She has lodged strangers. What does that demonstrate? Hospitality. And I like the way the New King James said she has lodged strangers. Hospitality, in the Bible sense, is caring for those who may not be able to return repay you. It very likely could be someone that you have not previously met. They're strangers. And we handle things a little differently today. And I'm not saying that this is wrong, but you know, when I was growing up, Gary can attest to this, and many others can attest to this. If you were traveling somewhere, or if you were going somewhere to preach, guess where you ended up staying? With somebody's house. And if it was the first time you'd been there, I'll tell you what you knew about them. You knew their name and where they lived, and when you went in, you met them. And then I've never had an experience where I was not treated like royalty. Here's lodging strangers. It may be a family of Christians passing through. And if we were further north, or bad weather, snow on the ground, you can't get any farther. And you know what would happen? You'd find out who were Christians in that area, and you might not have the money to go to. You might not could get to a hotel. You might not have the money, and you would stay. We've had people stay at our house when I was growing up. You know, just I didn't know them. I knew something about. Here's what I knew: were they were Christians, and our house was open to them. And so here is what is true of this woman. It goes on. It says, if she has washed the saints' feet. And again, what does that demonstrate? Service, humility. And I think most all of us, or all of us, understand that during that time when people traveled, they didn't have on the shoes and the socks and the boots and everything that we have. They might have a sandal on, something that would keep their feet from touching the ground, but when they got places, guess what? They needed their feet washed because they were dirty. And this,
Almost always that was done by a servant.
it was done, that's right. What does Jesus do to his disciples? He washes their feet.
And taught them.
And did he do that so that that could be a ritual that we would do as a part of the church and serving God? What does he say he does it for? He says, I do this for an example. He was showing them humility, because that's not what typically was done. As Lynn said, typically that would have been done by a servant. But here this woman has shown humility. She's relieved the afflicted. You know, what all might be involved in that. She's helped those who are afflicted. And then it says she has diligently followed every good work. She's just known for her good work. So here is a widow who is a widow indeed. And the church can provide support for a widow who is a widow indeed, to take care of her needs, however we want to say that. It's not in King James, the New King James, but the idea is being taken into the number or put on a list. Here the church is responsible for caring for this type of widow. Lynn, you started to say something.
Something Rohan taught us to do better. 5 ifs in that one verse.
Say that again.
I was about Rohan's presentation a few weeks ago. There are 5 ifs in that one verse. If.
Okay, all right.
In verse 10.
I got you. That's right. If.
Qualifiers.
That's right. Those are things that are qualifiers, things that have to be true. So, number one, does it matter if she's a Christian or not? It does matter. It does matter. This is talking to someone who the church is responsible for taking this type widow under their care, who is a Christian. She's 60 years old or older. She's had a family. She's brought up a family. She has been married. She's lodged strangers. She's done all these good works. And the church not only can, but it has the responsibility to do that. Anything else you want to say about the widows who are widows indeed, or really widows, as the New King James says? Rohan?
It said widow. If the man can't support either as a Christian, does the church support?
Well, not from this passage. This, and what I mean by that, Rohan, and how about this? We'll answer that here in just a second. I think we'll be able to answer that. But this is a woman whose husband is gone. He's dead. Okay? So what we've talked about so far applies simply to a woman whose husband is dead. She's a widow, and at least 60, and these other things are true of her, and the church can supply her needs. Okay, and I'm not going to forget your question. And if we don't touch on it, bring it up again.
Kim, if I may point out one other thing. A few years ago, we were doing a study on this with another church, and one thing that just stood out to me, you know, we hear people, especially women, criticize the church because it seems to be against women, putting women down. This is a huge benefit that when we're talking to people in the world, this is a counter to that criticism.
Right. That's right. Okay, let's talk about the other widows that are discussed in this passage. We've talked about 3, 4, and 5. Verse 6. Here is, if this is true of a widow that meets all these other qualifications, then she's not to be supported. It says in verse 6, but she who lives in pleasure is dead while she lives. Now that's in contrast to verse 5, one who trusts in God and continues in supplication and prayers night and day. But she who lives in pleasure is dead while she lives. So here is a woman who is 60. She's a widow. But what does it say here in verse 6? What does that mean?
Herself is involved about the world.
That's right. She's involved in the world. She's more concerned about the world. She lives in pleasure and says is dead while she lives. Dead in what sense? She's spiritually dead. She's spiritually dead. Let me drop down to, okay, verse 11. Let's start at verse 11. We'll come back to verse 8 here in just a minute. Verse 11. But refuse the younger widows. For when they have begun to grow wanton against Christ, you have a translation that uses a different word than wanton.
Sensual desires.
Sensual desires, okay. Passions, all right. Again, verse 11. For when they have begun to grow wanton against Christ, they desire to marry. Is that wrong for them to marry? No, it's not wrong. We're going to see that in just a minute. But he says, they desire to marry, having condemnation because they have cast off their first faith. Here, my understanding, here's someone who is a Christian. But they've left the faith. They've cast that faith off. They're not living as Paul describes here in these verses concerning a widow who is a widow indeed, or someone who is really a widow. And then he says, verse 13, besides this, they learn to do what? Learn to be idle. They learn to be idle. They learn to be idle. Wandering about from house to house. And you know, what is there's a saying about being idle. An idle mind, there you go, is the devil's workshop. Let me tell you what, we're going to fill our minds with something. And if we're not filling our minds with things that are good and righteous and things we ought to be doing, if we have an idle mind, then what will happen? He says, wandering about from house to house, not only idle, but also gossips and busybodies, saying things which they ought not.
What a lesson there.
What a lesson there. And this is specifically talking about younger women. Is there any lesson that a man can learn in those verses? Absolutely. Absolutely. You know, one of the things is if we keep ourselves busy doing what we need to do, what do we not have time to do? We don't have time to gossip. We don't have time. What is a busybody? Somebody who's into everybody else's business, trying to take care of everybody else's business except their own. A meddler. That's right, a meddler. And you can see all of the problems that come from being idle, gossiping, busybodies, saying things which they ought not. And then verse 14, therefore, in light of this, Paul says, I desire that the young widows marry. Is he saying that a young woman has to marry? No. He's not saying that. Is it wrong if she doesn't marry? The Bible doesn't teach that. But he's giving this admonition here in verse 14 to counteract what verse 13, what can be true. I desire that the younger widows marry, bear children, manage the house, give no opportunity to the adversary to speak reproachfully. So Paul's desire is that these younger women marry, bear children, manage the house. Do you have a translation that uses other wording other than manage the house? Guide the house. In Titus, does anyone have a translation here that says keep her at home? Okay, there it is. Keep her at home.
Which translation?
New American Standard. A keeper at home. What does that mean? A keeper at home. Does that mean she has to be at home all the time? That's not what that means.
It's basically ownership.
She has to manage, guide, take care of. She is in charge of the home. That's right. She has the responsibility.
Keep her from being busybody.
That's exactly right. And if you're busy doing what you ought to do, and then if the man is doing what he ought to do, then you eliminate all of these other problems that just kind of occur naturally because we're humans. He says in verse 15, for some have already turned aside after sex. Now I want to go back to verse 8 and then we'll get verse 16 also. And Rohan, this may get to what you asked a while ago. Verse 8 says, and we're talking about, he's just given, talking about widows indeed. He says, but if anyone does not provide for his own, and especially for those of his household, he has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. Go back to verse 2. If any widow has children or grandchildren, let them learn to show piety at home and repay their parents, for this is good and acceptable before God. Who has the responsibility of taking care of mama when she's a widow?
Children first.
Children first. Children, and who else? Grandchildren. And we need to teach as parents, we need to be sure our children understand that. Because their children need to understand that. And their children need to understand that. Here is God's, I don't know what word, Social Security problem, Social Security answer. When we get old, if we have children, we shouldn't have to fret as to how we're going to be cared for. Now, they may not be able to provide the same standard of living, but they'll care for us. Matter of fact, we have that responsibility to care for our parents, to care for our grandparents. And so when mother's taking care of her mother and is exhausted, really before she gets to that exhausting state, what ought to happen? Step in, help. There are other children, there are grandchildren, and typically, it's not true always, but typically there might be 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 or 7 children. There might be 8 or 10 or 12 grandchildren. There's enough to care. And that's what God wants to be done. And then he says in verse 8, if anyone does not provide for his own, and especially for those of his own household, he has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. I'll tell you, it is a serious, serious thing if we choose not to care for those of our own household. We have a responsibility. We have a God-given responsibility. And an unbeliever was bad, but he says this is worse than an unbeliever. This is worse than an infidel. And I take that to mean that people in the world who are not trying to serve the Lord, they would even do that. And so we want to make sure that we are doing what we should. Now let's go back to your question, Rohan. What was your question again? A woman whose husband cannot care for him. Is that what you're saying?
About a man.
A man, a widower, oh, reversing it, a widower.
Yeah.
What if there is a widower who's not able to provide for himself?
It's on us.
Okay, that's exactly right. Let's go back to this widow indeed. The widow indeed can be taken in the number. She can be taken on what we might say permanently. If we see a brother or sister in need, we can help individually. The church can help a Christian individually, but that would be different from taking them on permanently. So if there's a widower and he has needs and he's a Christian, then individuals and the church could help in a temporary way, but it's different from putting like these widows. One of the things during that time when a woman's husband died, she just about didn't have any way of providing for herself. And that was, and at one time, that was true here in the United States of America. You know, you go back before the war, and what did women where were women primarily? In the home. And what were husbands out doing? Trying to scratch out a living. Just trying to scratch out a living. If a husband died then, a woman would need help. But if you have children, grandchildren, then there's the help. And she'd have to be at least 60. Suppose there's a woman that's 50 who needs help, a widow, or not a widow. What do? We help her. We help her. We always help one another. But the difference is, and I don't know if I'm getting this across, the difference is these widows indeed are taken on permanently by the church to provide their needs because she has no one else.
There had been a problem in Jerusalem, a very problem.
That's exactly right. In Acts chapter 6, we read of the Hebrew widows who were being neglected. And that's a good point to bring up, Gary. Does that help you, Rohan? If you become a widower, brother, you're going to be taken care of. How about that? You need help, and that's going to be true of everybody else. That's part of God's insurance.
They become a needy saint.
That's right. They become a needy saint, just like we read of the saints in Jerusalem. That's exactly right. Tim?
I think the principle of the Good Samaritan falls out here too, because that's the whole point. That is what is taught all through the scriptures. If someone's in need, we help them.
Whether it's a Christian or not, as individuals, we ought to be willing and to help. We ought to be helping. There are instructions given to the church as to who the church out of its treasury can help. Can the church out of its treasury just help any and everybody?
No.
You don't find that in the Bible.
No.
You find that they were to give so that the saints could be cared for. Christians, other Christians. That's, again, if there's somebody outside who's not a Christian and we know they need help, we need to help them. If we can, we need to help them.
As individuals.
As individuals, that's exactly right. As individuals, we need to help them.
And that is the thing, I have to say, that is the thing that the world and even many who identify themselves as Church of Christ misunderstand.
Sure.
Our,
That's right.
And they will
That's right.
And it's not the church's responsibility. The church has a responsibility, first and foremost, spread the gospel.
That's the primary role. And we won't go into this, they give passages. It's not as if they don't have a passage to give, but we won't talk about that
So
right
I
now.
just wanted to say one thing. Verse 8, that's applicable irrespective of the age. I mean, if we take, Caleb, young man, with married wife, he is to be the breadwinner there. I mean, it's to take care of.
Yes.
That's not past 60 or whatever.
Oh, no. Here he just says, if anyone, so it applies to
That's
those who can provide for themselves and others. All right, 17. Let the elders who rule well be counted worthy of double honor, especially those who labor in the word and doctrine. For the scripture says, you shall not muzzle an ox while it treads out the grain, and the laborer is worthy of his hire. Do not receive an accusation against an elder except from 2 or 3 witnesses. Those who are sinning rebuke in the presence of all, that the rest also may fear. Who are the elders here, or the older men here? Talking about bishops, pastors, overseers, those who, and he says, what is the idea of double honor? Okay, hard working. You go down to verse 18 and at the end of verse 17, labors in the word and doctrine. Do not muzzle the ox, he's worthy of his wages. Here is a man, and then one of the questions in our book was, can a preacher also be an elder? He can. Under what conditions? If he's qualified to serve as an elder. Whether he preaches or not, that's beside the point. I had a Christian ask me that once. He said, is it okay for a preacher to be an elder? I said, well, if he's qualified, it is. Peter was, wasn't he? Peter was an elder. He was also a preacher of the gospel. If an accusation is made against an elder, that's not a trivial thing. What does he say? 2 or 3 witnesses. Now, he also says in verse 20, those who are sinning rebuke in the presence of all. Why? So the rest may fear. Here is somebody sinning. And as opposed to Matthew 18, where you got somebody who sinned against another person, you go to him. Here is someone who has sinned in public. You know how you take care of a public sin? You don't take care of a public sin privately. You take care of a public sin publicly. Now, if it's an individual matter like Matthew 18, 15, you go to that person. It can be taken care of privately between 2 people. That's the way the Lord wants it handled. But he says it's to be done publicly so that the rest may fear.
It's like in the nicest fire.
That's right.
Same reason.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right.
Still.
Verse 21. I charge you before God and the Lord Jesus Christ and the elect angels that you observe these things without prejudice, doing nothing with partiality. Is that pretty much self-explanatory? We treat everybody accordingly to God's word. Doesn't matter who it is. Here he's talking about elders. If it's a Bible class teacher, if it's a preacher, it doesn't matter. If someone sins publicly, that needs to be made right publicly. And if a person is unwilling to make it right publicly, that needs to be known, and whatever else needs to be done. And there are other things that can and should be done. But again, correct it publicly. Do not lay hands on anyone hastily or sharing other people's sins. Keep yourself poor. If you're mad at somebody, don't hit them quickly. I had somebody tell me that, that's not what's that talking about? Do not lay hands on anyone suddenly. Don't make rash decisions. Laying hands, what's the idea of laying hands? It's giving your approval. Here again, the context seems to me that here are elders, and elders, when they're selected and chosen and given approval, you don't want to do that hastily. You want to take your time. You want to make sure that you know and everything is done as it should be done. No longer drink only water, but use a little wine for your stomach's sake and your frequent infirmities. You know, we could discuss a long time about that wine, whether it's fermented or not. But what's the use? What is the use? What's this to be used for? For medicinal purposes, and how much? And if we don't get that, then anything else we say, it misses the whole point. This is not, if it is fermented, it's not just somebody taking a drink to kind of make them feel better. You know, it's medicinal purposes, and it's to be lit. He says, some men's sins are clearly evident, preceding them to judgment, but those of some men follow later. You can see the sins of some people. But what about people's sins that you can't see? God's going to judge. Verse 25, likewise, also the good works of some are clearly evident, and those that are otherwise cannot be hidden. God sees everything, and God will judge us accordingly, and we may hide things from each other, but we'll never hide anything from God. All right, that takes our time, and Lord willing, we'll start with chapter 6 Wednesday night, and we'll